So, good evening, or good morning. We're continuing with the 16th chapter of the Life Divine tonight, the triple status of supermind. We're roughly midway through the chapter. Sri Aurobindo has asserted that there is a conscious being who is the sole reality, inalienable to itself, and from its unitary station within its own being, determines to advance itself into the manifestation of the many. It does this through a mediating conscious power, conscious force, which in English Sri Aurobindo calls the supermind. This supermind takes the undivided unity of Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, and renders it multiple, but by it becoming multiple, does not become divided. So the universe is a play of conscious force. And those of you who are familiar with Sri Aurobindo's book, The Mother, know well that in the 6th chapter, there's a line that says, "The one whom we adore as the Supreme is the divine conscious force who dominates all existence." That same consciousness force that is innate as the power of conscious being in Satchit Ananda is that mother consciousness that releases all into play. So all is a creative play of this one being who undertakes all of this as a matter of self-extension. Sri Aurobindo is going to describe to us 3 poises of this intermediate consciousness, which he calls the supermind, by which Satchitananda becomes multiple and expressive. And we'll spend the rest of this evening looking at those 3. So let's pick up where his paragraph begins. We have seen what is the nature of this first and primary poise of the supermind, which founds the inalienable unity of things. Again, inalienable, that term that has been transferred here into metaphysics from political philosophy, which means that which cannot be transferred away or cannot be removed. So it can't be taken from you if it's inalienable to you, and you can't give it away. It's your very nature. I can't give you some aspect of my being without it depriving me of existence. And the existence, the sole existence that is, does not abrogate the unity of its own being in manifesting. So this first poise, he says, is not the pure Unitarian consciousness, for that is a timeless and spaceless concentration of Satchit Ananda in itself, in which conscious force does not cast itself out into any kind of extension, and if it contains the universe at all, contains it in eternal potentiality and not in temporal actuality. So we've already seen that in the supermind there is the seed of extensibility. There is the seed of temporal succession, all of this housed in an infinite and in an eternity, which are native to Satchit Ananda. So Satchit Ananda, even when we examine it in its Chit aspect, is really Chit Shakti, conscious power, conscious force. But even there, the power inheres, sticks to itself, and does not throw itself out into expansiveness. So he continues, and he's describing, well, let's continue. This, on the contrary, is an equal self-extension of Satchit Ananda, all comprehending, all possessing, all constituting. The this is this first poise of the supramental consciousness. It draws out from Satchitananda its nature of equality. It becomes this broad, comprehensive, oceanic being which contains all within it. All is possessed by it. Everything within it is constituted by it. So this, if you can say that Satchitananda is an unnameable, uncountable oneness, here we get the ground of existence brought into formation so that the rest of the manifestation can proceed. So this matches our general idea in Vedantic philosophy of what is the homogeneous Brahman, unpartite, unmixed, absolute being. But here we're seeing it as the ground of all, what comprehends all, what is that which underlies all. He continues, but this all is one, not many. So if all is going to exist in this, it still does not subtract from or diminish in any way the oneness that is Satchit Ananda, established as this first poise, this primary poise of the supermind. Now, it is when the reflection of this supermind falls upon our stilled and purified self that we lose all sense of individuality. For there is no concentration of consciousness there to support an individual development. So this explains the unitive experience that sages have got over the millenniums. When they approach that reflected into their still mind, it seems as if it's an absolute, might be a vacancy, might be an impartite one. But the all falls away. There is no individualization, as he says. For there is no concentration of consciousness there to support an individual development. All is developed in unity and as one. All is held by this divine consciousness as forms of its existence, not as in any degree separate existences. So the all exist within the one. And the supermind, we might say, is light itself and not a reflection. So what the mind experiences by reflecting this supreme creative consciousness of the divine is interpreted in its own divided capacity as being, that is true, this is not true. To the supramental consciousness, that division never occurs. And he'll explain that more as we proceed. Somewhat, as the thoughts and images that occur in our mind are not separate existences to us, but forms taken by our consciousness, so are all names and forms to this primary supermind. So, these, he will say, are drawn from the reality of this unitive consciousness. It is the pure divine ideation and formation in the infinite, only an ideation and formation that is organized not as an unreal play of mental thought, but as a real play of conscious being. We cannot fully analogize what our mental operations are and transfer them to the supramental. We can have a fantasy. We can think something up. We can make a concoction in our mind and it have no reality. It can be vacuous. It can be something that exists in our own head. Nobody else participates in it. But in the supramental consciousness, all ideas are real. All ideas are part of the one. All are part of the one. One dwells in the all. In this primary stage or poise of the supermind, the play of conscious being is real. Remember, he is called the supermind the real idea. Ideas that emerge from the supramental consciousness carry the force of truth in them because they are the direct translation of Satchit Ananda into multiplied becoming. What moves out is necessarily true because it comes from authentic being. In our divided mind, we may think all sorts of things, but they are disconnected from power. Here, consciousness is force, is existence, resulting in delight. In the mind, we don't have that experience. We aspire to it, but we don't attain it. Back to Sri Aurobindo. The divine soul in this poise would make no difference between conscious soul and force soul, for all force would be action of consciousness, nor between matter and spirit, since all mold would be simply form of spirit. So what proceeds outward in terms of the power is truth force. And all renderings into shape would be true in shape, would be valid expressions of a spiritual reality. And they would be essentially the same. There would be no distinction between what is based in consciousness, so to our sight, or what is based in force, so to our sight. They would be essentially the same thing. There is no division in the supramental. There is only, again, differentiation. Well, this is how he describes the primary poise of the supermind. So this is that comprehensive status where everything is folded within its Unitarian consciousness, rendered into extensibility. He continues now. In the second poise of the supermind, the divine consciousness stands back in the idea from the movement which it contains, realizing it by a sort of apprehending consciousness, following it, occupying and inhabiting its works, seeming to distribute itself in its forms. I've read it like that because I think it's important to catch that connotation. These are its own works, these are its own forms. They don't exist outside its own being. These are within the movement. But the supramental consciousness is gazing at itself, watching itself do manifold things. And as it watches, it inhabits. Always it contains, occupies. And so, here is the difference. If the first was all-containing, here is a movement of consciousness in the supramental where the container is still there, yes, but it is watching itself. It stands back and begins to witness its own works. Even as it enters into them, there is a concentration of consciousness in the subjective aspect. So let's continue then. In each name and form, it would realize itself as the stable, conscious self, the same in all. But also, it would realize itself as a concentration of conscious self, following and supporting the individual play of movement and upholding its differentiation from other play of movement, the same everywhere in soul essence, but varying in soul form. It's interesting, in the Arya, Sri Aurobindo had originally typed this out as conscious soul. He's changed it here to conscious self, so as to make sure we're making the connection with the Vedantic terminology that we're familiar with and which is necessary to understand what he's trying to say philosophically in these pages. So it's the same stable conscious self, but it's also a concentrated conscious self in each one of these poises. And so all the individual movements are upheld as differentiations of that one, but continuing to be the same in soul essence. So the form varies endlessly to the view, but the essence remains the same. So each would find the ground of its own truth to be common with all others. We're the same. But each would recognize that it is a unique and authentic formation of that same. There is no high or low, there is no better or less. Each is valid. And so here we come to a term that you're going to want to remember later. It's particularly important in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. This concentration supporting the soul form would be the individual divine or jivatman, as distinguished from the universal divine or one all-constituting self. So we have the idea of what one self is, but this is the individual aspect of it, which he calls the Jivatman. Literally it means the living self. But he's using it in a particular way, because here the universal divine has taken a stance as an individual, and not just as one individual, but as all possible individuals, without losing its basis in the essential oneness of the divine. So he continues, after describing this, there would be no essential difference, but only a practical differentiation for the play which would not abrogate the real unity. So no essential difference between the individual divine and the universal divine. But there's a practical division so that the play can go forward. Why is there a play? So that the divine can experience itself as multiple oneness and enjoy it. So this is all for the delight of the divine, that the universe begins to come into creation in the supramental. And in this second poise, we begin to get a sense of the drift of it. The real unity is retained, but there is practical differentiation so that we can proceed from the beginning to the end and have delight along the way. So, you begin to get the sense of that image that we've referred to in earlier weeks of the peacock fan, that spreads its tail wide, and then each of the feathers has an eye which sees all the other eyes and recognizes, oh, that's just the same as me, but different. And all see each. The universal sees each and says, oh, you're great, love you, just like you are. And all of them are from the one. They exist in the one peacock, expressive powers of that single essence. That's why Sri Aurobindo called the peacock the bird of victory, bird of spiritual victory. Because when you really get to that state where the essentiality of things does not abrogate the diversity of things, but all enjoy each enjoys all, and yet all are aware of the essential one. Now you have the ground upon which you can move towards transferring that consciousness into the play of matter in terms of transformation. In other words, rendering the psychological reality valid and experiential in the body. So let's again continue. The universal divine would know all soul forms, or jivatmans, as itself, and yet establish a different relation with each separately, and in each with all the others. The individual divine would envisage its existence as a soul form and soul movement of the one, and, while by the comprehending action of consciousness it would enjoy its unity with the one and with all soul forms, it would also, by a forward or frontal apprehending action, support and enjoy its individual movement and its relations of a free difference in unity, both with the one and with all its forms. So Sri Aurobindo has described how the one regards the individual and how the individual regards the one, and there is no sense anywhere yet of a separate individuality. All is still housed or based in that, but there is this forward or frontal movement by which the consciousness goes out to apprehend the truth of that which it views and discover, you're the same. You are delight. You are truth. You are conscious force. It's a description of the soul playing with the one and the all. An element in the three, the one, the all, and the individual soul, in perfect harmony. He continues, if our purified mind were to reflect this secondary poise of supermind, our soul could support and occupy its individual existence, and yet, even there, realize itself as the one that has become all, inhabits all, contains all, enjoying, even in its particular modification, its unity with God and its fellows. So just as that primary poise of the supermind, with its vast comprehensiveness, could be realized by the sage in the mind as an unabrogated unity, and you can just say that only exists. So might somebody, a sage, realize in the mind this secondary poise of the supermind could be reflected in it and see that all are one, one is all, and there's complete unity between the one and the many. So the mind is capable of reflecting these higher truths, but does not realize them correctly or completely, but can catch something of them, and that truth is imparted to it insofar as it can hold it. The mind, not being as vast as the supermind, cannot get it utterly, but it gets at least something. In no other circumstance of the supramental existence would there be any characteristic change. The only change would be this play of the one that has manifested its multiplicity, and of the many that are still one, with all that is necessary to maintain and conduct the play. So the play is now coming into prominence from the vast ground of the primary poise of the supermind, bringing that infinite Satchidanda into unitary space and time so that it can manifest a world, establishes in the secondary poise the balance of the many in the one. The conduct of the play begins, and we're suggested to view here a balance and harmony, unity in diversity, multiplicity in oneness. There is no discord. All is a harmony. So primary poise, secondary poise. A third poise of the supermind would be attained if the supporting concentration were no longer to stand at the back, as it were, of the movement, inhabiting it with a certain superiority to it, and so following and enjoying, but were to project itself into the movement and to be in a way involved in it. Here, the character of the play would be altered, but only insofar as the individual divine would so predominantly make the play of relations with the universal and with its other forms the practical field of its conscious experience, that the realization of utter unity with them would be only a supreme accompaniment and constant culmination of all experience. But in the higher poise, unity would be the dominant and fundamental experience, and variation would be only a play of the unity. So this is a projecting soul force which implants itself in the movement of creativity. Unity in this play is postponed until it reaches a culminating discovery, like a crescendo in a symphony or the climax of a play. That unity is achieved, but at the end of the play, it's in a sense kept behind by itself, for itself, so that it gets to enjoy it at the end. I will do all this work and then I'll take a bath. I'll eat all this food and then I'll have dessert. I'll go through all this trouble and then discover that, there is the all, just where I left it, and everything. So again, unity would be the dominant and fundamental experience. Variation would be only a play of the unity. This tertiary poise, and I think last week I mispronounced that word. I think I did. I think I pronounced it as tertiary. It's tertiary. It means third, by the way. This tertiary poise would be therefore that of a sort of fundamental blissful dualism in unity, no longer qualified by a subordinate dualism between the individual divine and its universal source, with all the consequences that would accrue from the maintenance and operation of such a dualism. So this would permit a dualism in unity. Remember, unity has not been lost here, but it's a play as if I'm entering into this play and I'm pretending I'm this, I'm going to be this, you're going to be that, we're going to have this interaction, and a delight will be the result of that interaction, but at the end of the play. But that does provide us with a ground of dualism within the unity. This again is in the supramental consciousness. We're not talking about our experience in the mind. We're talking about what the divine experiences in its own creative consciousness. By the way, Sri Aurobindo had amended this sentence to a point. Now, I'm dropping some of the notes about where he changed words here and there, because it might be too much to follow the progress of his argument and attend to all those details. But he had originally written here a sort of fundamental blissful dualism between the individual divine and its universal source, with all the consequences that would accrue from the maintenance and operation of such a dualism. He decided to inject, to make sure that we got what he's talking about, a fundamental blissful dualism in unity. And then, between M dashes, no longer unity qualified by a subordinate dualism, which is what we have at the second poise, because there unity is still prominent, and even if there is the beginning of a kind of differentiation in dualism, subject, object can look at themselves, they're subordinated to the unity. Here, the play of differentiation comes more to the forward, gets more force, and unity recedes to the background a bit. So you can see why he changed that sentence, to make sure that that connotation got through to the reader. So now on to the next paragraph. It may be said that the first consequence would be a lapse into the ignorance of avidya, which takes the many for the real fact of existence and views the one only as a cosmic sum of the many. Well, we might take that position if we were logistic philosophers. He says, but there would not necessarily be any such lapse in that consciousness. The mind might work that way, that if this diversity comes into being, then we would be necessarily thrown into an ignorance and the diversity would lose the oneness. That's another argument for another time. But in the supramental, he says, there would not necessarily be any such lapse. For the individual divine would still be conscious of itself as the result of the one and of its power of conscious self-creation. So it hasn't lost its status in the oneness. It's still aware of that. That is to say, of its multiple self-concentration, conceived so as to govern and enjoy. So it's multiplied itself in these many, many concentrations of itself as these soul forms of the Jivatman, so as to enjoy manifoldly its manifold existence in the extension of time and space. So this oneness has self-concentrated so that it can enjoy in terms of the manifestation, which requires temporal extension and spatial extension. And in that manifold, enjoys delight. This true spiritual individual would not arrogate to itself an independent or separate existence. And here, this true spiritual individual again, the source of individuality in the one who becomes the many is the Jivatman. You may want to refer back and find that sentence. The true source of the individual is that stance which occurs within the oneness. And I think a later image that was useful in understanding this is that if you can imagine a diamond with many facets, many facets, each facet would be a true feature of that diamond. And yet the diamond remains entirely itself. And the diamond is that which carved each facet, let's say. Let's further posit. Well, that diamond would be like the consciousness of the supramental, bringing something infinite and unknowable into form, the diamond, and then fashioning all of these facets, each one of which is true, each one of which is the Jivatman, the true individuality, but never having lost its seat upon the oneness of the diamond. So to continue again, it would only affirm the truth of the differentiating movement along with the truth of the stable unity, regarding them as the upper and lower poles of the same truth, the foundation and culmination of the same divine play. And it would insist on the joy of the differentiation as necessary to the fullness of the joy of the unity. So, why is there a universe? The divine wanted to take its endless potentiality and manifest it manifoldly, and to enter into it and there discover the Ananda in the multiple. Not just to keep it as an absolute, always contained, silent, static oneness above time and space. It says, let me enter into all of this and find that same delight there that I have up here. It is a deliberate movement of consciousness that the divine has chosen. As it envisages it, as conscious force, it does it. And what does it do? It takes its own real existence and multiplies it for the process of delight. So Sri Aurobindo continues then, obviously these three poises would be only different ways of dealing with the same truth. The truth of existence enjoyed would be the same. The way of enjoying it, or rather the poise of the soul in enjoying it, would be different. The delight, the ananda, would vary but would abide always within the status of the truth consciousness and involve no lapse into the falsehood and the ignorance. For the secondary and tertiary supermind would only develop and apply in the terms of the divine multiplicity what the primary supermind had held in the terms of the divine unity. So, if that primary poise of the supermind has drawn the reality and the conscious force and the delight of Satchit Ananda into its pool or its ocean of existence, that is the ground upon which all the rest of this has proceeded, and so cannot be false, cannot be ignorant. It is regnant, it rules, it is conscious, it is aware of itself. Its delight is not absent. So he says we cannot stamp any of these three poises with the stigma of falsehood and delusion. The language of the Upanishads, the supreme ancient authority for these truths of a higher experience, when they speak of the divine existence which is manifesting itself, implies the validity of all these experiences. And we've seen citations from the Brihadaranyaka, the Chandogya, the Munnaka, the Isha, the Mandukya. On we go. All of them attesting to the reality of this divine being who is stationed in all of these poises, transcendent, universal, divine, wondering at the immensity of what this conscious power might do. The sages speak in the Upanishads in tones which you have to hear the Sanskrit to appreciate the thrill in their words. They are ecstatic, they are in rhapsody. This divine, Brahman above us, Brahman below us, Brahman behind us, Brahman around us. All is Brahman, everything in this universe. So it is founded, this experience, even if it only is housed in the human heart and scanned briefly by the human mind, is there permanently, a feature of the divine consciousness at the supramental level. This is how God sees and experiences the multiplicity emerging from his one being. But Sri Aurobindo now makes another point. We can only assert the priority of the oneness to the multiplicity, a priority not in time but in relation of consciousness, and no statement of supreme spiritual experience, no Vedantic philosophy denies this priority or the eternal dependence of the many on the one. He wants to be straight on this. He's not saying that the many came first and then the one is a composite of it. No. In terms of consciousness, that absolute, whether we call it non-being or being, that renders itself as Satchit Ananda, approachable to the mind, which takes its infinity and diversifies, harmonizes itself in the creative consciousness of the supermind, still that oneness is fundamental and the many depend upon the one. But he also continues, it is because in time the many seem not to be eternal, but to manifest out of the one and return into it as their essence, that their reality is denied. This is true of certain schools of Vedantic thought. Because the many depend upon the one, then they don't really exist. Only that one is fundamentally real. But Sri Aurobindo counters, but it might equally be reasoned that the eternal persistence, or if you will, the eternal recurrence of the manifestation in time, is a proof that the divine multiplicity is an eternal fact of the Supreme beyond time, no less than the divine unity. Otherwise, it could not have this characteristic of inevitable eternal recurrence in time. And this is another feature of Vedantic philosophy, that some schools assert that endlessly, endlessly. The divine breathes out a universe, brings it back into itself, breathes it out again. Sometimes is seen through creative personalities of the divine, whether it is the Mahashakti, or it is Brahma, the creator. There is this idea that the universe is always going forward, and even if it is brought back, it will be repeated again, in a sense being recycled over and over and over again. So if there is this power of eternal recurrence, then perhaps there is an eternal reason for it. The divine wants to do this. It is not an accident, it is not a mistake, it is not an action of ignorance. The divine is not ignoring itself in so doing, it is positing itself. It says, I will become this, and I will be the many in this. Station myself in each and in all, and find myself at the end of the play. One more paragraph, shall we? It is indeed only when our human mentality lays an exclusive emphasis on one side of spiritual experience, affirms that to be the sole eternal truth, and states it in the terms of our all-dividing mental logic, that the necessity for mutually destructive schools of philosophy arises. Thus, emphasizing the sole truth of the Unitarian consciousness, we observe the play of the divine unity, erroneously rendered by our mentality into the terms of real difference, but not satisfied with correcting this error of the mind by the truth of a higher principle, we assert that the play itself is an illusion. Or, emphasizing the play of the one in the many, we declare a qualified unity and regard the individual soul as a sole form of the Supreme, but would assert the eternity of this qualified existence and deny altogether the experience of a pure consciousness in an unqualified oneness. Or again, emphasizing the play of difference, we assert that the Supreme and the human soul are eternally different and reject the validity of an experience which exceeds and seems to abolish that difference. So the first position is the position of Advaita Vedanta, where no, only that is real and this apparent difference is erasable. And the second, there's a qualified unity, is the position of Vishishtadvaita, qualified non-dualism, in which the individual soul is a form of the Supreme, but that philosophy cannot admit that there is a pure consciousness transcendent of all of this, in which it exists in an unqualified oneness, which, remember, is key to Sri Aurobindo's position as well. That non-being, which is the same thing as the being, which we call Satchit Ananda, retains its capacity as a transcendence, as non-being, to escape even its affirmation of itself. It is always even free of that. So it can be that. It can be an absolute oneness. It can be something beyond oneness as well. And beyond the play of difference, beyond the assertion of individuality. And then the third position, emphasizing the play of difference, that's the Dvaita, the school of duality. Dvaita means two. Vishishta Dvaita, qualified non-dualism. And Advaita means not two. For all of these, of course, have a fundamental truth in them which should not be lost sight of. There is an individual soul. It is related to the Supreme, so the view of dualism has a kind of psychological truth in it. Vishishtadvaita qualified non-dualism is also true, because the individual exists, but exists always in oneness with the Supreme Divine. And also the experience of Advaita is true. There is the experience of an absolute consciousness, unknowable, impartite, undivided, unmanifest. Each of these things is true. We are invited to have an experience large enough to include them all, and not to exclude any part or parcel of reality. Sri Aurobindo then is, as he'll say in a moment, he's insisting on the freedom of the divine to experience itself in all these voices, in all these stances. So let's get to his closing statement. But the position that we have now firmly taken absolves us from the necessity of these negations and exclusions. We see that there is a truth behind all these affirmations, but at the same time, an excess which leads to an ill-founded negation. Affirming, as we have done, the absoluteness of that, not limited by our ideas of unity, not limited by our ideas of multiplicity, affirming the unity as a basis for the manifestation of the multiplicity, and the multiplicity as the basis for the return to oneness and the enjoyment of unity in the divine manifestation, we need not burden our present statement with these discussions or undertake the vain labor of enslaving to our mental distinctions and definitions the absolute freedom of the divine infinite. Sri Aurobindo has added some language to strengthen his position here. This section which reads, we see that there is a truth behind all these affirmations, but at the same time an excess which leads to an ill-founded negation. This was added when he rewrote this chapter, reviewed it and added a few things, a change here, a change there. So the affirmations are all true, but the negations are ill-founded. All these positions, which spiritually we can realize, have their truth force in them. We must not say no to it. But in saying yes, we also must reserve for the divine, permit it to have the absolute freedom which it deserves and which it demands. The last word, infinite, was added by Sri Aurobindo later. It read, undertake the vain labor of enslaving to our mental distinctions and definitions the absolute freedom of the divine. He added infinite to make sure that we get this idea. The divine is not simply the supramental consciousness. The divine is that which is free even of its manifestation, even of its positive definition as Satchit Ananda. It is even greater than that. So, in front of an all-swallowing reality like that, perhaps silence is a fitting approach. So tonight again, I think, is a concluded chapter, but also opportunity to note that today is Easter in the Christian religion, and powerfully symbolic in that the consciousness of the individual, which seems to be submerged in darkness, to be swallowed by death, after 3 days, emerges triumphant, is a notion that is repeated in many mystic philosophies across the world, and borne out by experience, that after a being has departed and experienced death, there is a gradual reawakening to the nature of itself. But what this means is particularly important in that death cannot abolish light. Death cannot abbreviate. Death can only punctuate. And the resurrection of a Christ figure is important not simply because of its mythical impact, but because it has a real translation into the power of your own soul. You don't have to be a Christian to recognize that you cannot be diminished by death. Once you have been conceived by the divine consciousness, you simply exist. And as the Bhagavad Gita says, that which exists cannot go out of existence. There is no need for our fear to immobilize us and render us inconfident in our conduct of life. Because all of our actions are consecrations. And all that we do is part of a divine play, which has been conceived up there and manifested here. We are not here by accident. We are here by and through a decisive choice that we made ourselves. We have not been flung down here into a field of darkness only to gather ourselves for an ascent which leaves us as it was, but rather we have entered this field in order to change it, and to change ourselves, to rediscover our own soul, to discover joy unending by finding it everywhere and all sourced above. So the idea of freedom from death means conquest of division and conquest of darkness. Light cannot be extinguished. It arises again and again and again, because light is our source, as I think we read last week. From light we come, and to light we go. Light, endless light, is the refrain of one of Sri Aurobindo's fine poems. So, next week we take up the 17th chapter in the Life Divine. It's entitled The Divine Soul. Let me mention that tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m. the center will host a meditation for our dear Ram, who left his body on the 25th of March. So, wherever you are, if you can attune your consciousness to where he is, above in Mother's consciousness, in her lap, and send a wave of peace and love and light, he will happily receive it. more than Jai Ma. Namaste.
Namaste.